There is a very particular day in your journey, but it is not marked by a breakup, no confrontation, no decisive declaration, not even a clear emotional climax. It is the day you detach emotionally. On that day, you stop trying to understand them, stop trying to explain yourself, stop trying to be right, and stop trying to be forgiven. You do not hate, you do not love, you do not resist, you simply stop participating. And it is precisely that quiet moment when a narcissist's power begins to die. Most people believe a narcissist loses power when they are exposed, rejected, or abandoned. But that is only the surface. The deeper and more unsettling truth is that their power does not lie in what they do, but in the extent to which you are still being pulled into their inner world. They do not live on love. They live on reactions, on attention, on your effort to keep everything from collapsing. And for a very long time, you did this unconsciously. You became the place they leaned on to feel valuable, the surface in which they saw their reflection, the person who carried the chaos they could not face. Until the day you no longer do. According to Carl Jung, a psychological structure can exist only as long as someone else carries what it cannot integrate itself. When that energy is withdrawn back to the self, when you stop projecting, stop holding the role, that structure does not collapse because it is attacked, but because it is no longer being fed. This video is not about revenge. It is not about winning. It does not teach you what to do to a narcissist. It simply decodes a truth that very few people dare to face. The day you emotionally detach is not the day you lose them. It is the day you reclaim yourself and the day their power no longer has anywhere to stand. The power of a narcissist, when stripped down to its very core, has never been inner strength or personal solidity. It is a purely external form of regulation, a psychological self-regulation mechanism that survives by feeding on others. Inside them, there is no stable foundation strong enough to withstand their own emotions, emptiness, shame, or insecurity. And so they are forced to find a ground outside themselves in order to stand. In the relationship, without realizing it, you became that ground. Their power does not operate through crude domination or overt coercion, but through something far more subtle, the ability to trigger reactions and compel your participation. As long as you are still reacting, still explaining, still trying to understand them, still questioning what you did wrong, still hoping that things can somehow be fixed, their power structure remains alive. Every reaction of yours, whether love, pain, anger, or even a silence filled with expectation, becomes a confirmation signal that the system is still functioning, that they still have a place to deposit the inner chaos they cannot carry themselves. From a Jungian perspective, the persona cannot exist without a stage, and the shadow cannot be pushed away without a container. The narcissist, therefore, always needs another human being to serve simultaneously as a mirror and as a vessel. You were not merely a partner or a companion. You became the surface on which they reflected their ego, the place where they unloaded their weakness, rage, and emptiness, the parts they lacked the capacity to integrate. The tragedy is that this role is never named, never negotiated. It unfolds quietly, inch by inch, until one day you find yourself exhausted without fully understanding why. The narcissist's power, then, does not lie in status, words, or visible behavior, but in whether you are still standing inside that system, whether you are still allowing yourself to be pulled into their regulatory rhythm, or whether you have withdrawn. They do not fear being hated, criticized, or even physically abandoned, because all of those are still reactions, still forms of participation. What they truly cannot tolerate is the moment when you are no longer a place for them to stand, no longer a mirror for them to see themselves, no longer a container for the shadow they have spent their lives avoiding. When you face this truth directly, you begin to understand why a narcissist's power can collapse so quickly in silence. It was never truly theirs. It was always borrowed from your reactions. Power, ultimately, is not what they do to you, but what you continue to do to keep that structure alive. And the moment you stop reacting, stop participating, stop being the ground beneath it, that power has nothing left to cling to. And here, a major misconception must be dismantled. If you do not see this clearly, you will believe you are suffering because of a person, when in fact, what keeps you trapped is a story. You are not addicted to them as a concrete individual with specific traits, behaviors, or choices. What you are attached to is the narrative, the relationship created inside you, the story in which you are finally seen, chosen, special, safe, enough. As long as that story exists, you feel that you have a place, meaning, and weight in someone else's world. And it is that feeling, not the person, that you fear losing. The narcissist understands this instinctively, even if they are rarely conscious of it. They do not need you for who you are. They need you because you help sustain a story in which they hold power, centrality, and value. You were not only loving a person, you were living inside an imagined structure where everything seemed to have order, roles, and the promise of repair and completion. When that structure begins to crack, what panics you is not the loss of them, but the collapse of the story itself, and with it, the identity you had attached to that story. You hurt because a version of yourself that existed within that relationship no longer has a place to live. This is why many people can endure damaging relationships for years, yet completely collapse when they finally end. They were not living in reality, but in hope, in the belief that one day it will be different. In the role of the understanding one, the rescuer, the one who stays so everything does not fall apart. A narcissist does not need chains to imprison you. They only need to keep the story running. As long as you believe in it, you remain voluntarily inside the system. This is where their power becomes most refined. You believe you are loving, trying, sacrificing for the relationship, when in truth you are protecting a psychological structure that has become the source of your self-definition. Before detachment, you are not only afraid of losing them, you are afraid of losing the version of yourself that existed within that story. That is why emotional detachment does not happen as a simple, rational decision, but as a slow dissolution of illusion. Layers of meaning fall away, roles become empty, hopes lose their ability to hold you up. And when this narrative begins to collapse, the narcissist senses the threat immediately, not because they fear losing you, but because they fear losing structural supply, the person who kept their story credible. This is also why their most intense reactions rarely appear when you are angry or devastated, but when you become quiet, neutral, and emotionally uninvested. At that point, the story has no narrator, the stage has no audience, and their power begins to lose its footing. If you look deeply enough at this moment, you will realize that detachment is not an act against them, but the moment you stop living through a story that once made you feel safe while quietly stripping you of inner sovereignty. This is where the real axis of change begins to form. What comes first is not peace, nor strength in the conventional sense, but a strange emptiness, the emptiness that appears when you are no longer regulating someone else's emotions, yet have not fully built a new foundation for yourself. This is the phase where many people misunderstand what is happening and turn back, believing that detachment means loss, emptiness, or becoming cold. The truth is the opposite. That emptiness is not a sign of decay. It is the first evidence that you have stopped being the ground for a structure that was never yours. While you were entangled with a narcissist, your inner world was rarely neutral. It was stretched constantly between hope and disappointment, effort and self-blame, love and vigilance. When you detach, that chain of activation abruptly disappears, and your nervous system encounters something entirely new. There is no one left to react to, no one to fix, no one to save. The narcissist calls this coldness or indifference. But at a deeper level, it is the moment you reclaim ownership of your inner world. You no longer allow your emotions to be determined by their gaze, their silence, or their contradictory behavior. And here, The narcissist's power begins to lose effectiveness in a way they cannot control, because their entire system is built on the assumption that someone else will always regulate what they cannot. When you step out of that position, they do not only lose you, they lose the mechanism that protected them from facing themselves. This is why, after detachment, they often fall into extreme reactions: confusion, rage, smear campaigns, or manipulative silence. Not because you have done something to them, but because their inner system has lost its familiar point of support. What matters is this: their chaos is not a signal for you to return. It is proof that you withdrew from the right place. At the deepest level, detachment is not cutting the bond with them, but severing the bond between your value and their reactions. Once that link is dismantled, the power they once held cannot be recreated because it was never in their hands. It was always in whether you allowed yourself to be pulled in. When you were still inside that relationship, everything felt life or death. A delayed message could destabilize you. Silence could make you doubt your worth. Emotional distance could trigger panic and an urgent need to repair. This was not because you were weak, but because the system you were living in required you to function that way in order to survive. Narcissists do not operate on mutual attachment. They operate on an emotional economy where everything is measured in reactions. When you detach, that economy collapses abruptly. This creates not only a crisis for them, but a rebound shock for you as well, because for the first time you must face a question you long avoided. If there is no them, no role, no story, then who am I? Many people turn back at this point, not because they love the narcissist too deeply to leave, but because they fear confronting a self that has not yet been independently built. But if you stay with this moment long enough, if you resist filling the emptiness with a new relationship, a new hope, or a new explanation, you will begin to feel a subtle yet critical shift. Your emotions no longer react around them. You feel sadness, but without panic. You remember, but memory no longer pulls you back. You feel pain, but it no longer robs you of direction. This is the sign that the energy once drained outward is slowly returning inward. In Jungian terms, libido is being withdrawn back to the self, rather than remaining projected onto an object incapable of holding it. At this stage, the narcissist often becomes restless. They sense the change even if you say nothing, not because you are stronger in confrontation, but because you are no longer regulating them. Without a regulator, they are forced to face the very states they have spent a lifetime exporting: emptiness, shame, insecurity, and the absence of an inner core. Many people misinterpret this reaction as love, concern, or lingering attachment. The truth is colder. It is the sign of a power system deprived of its fuel. The narcissist is not suffering because they lost you as a person. They are panicking because they lost the function you served in their inner life. And here, a clear boundary must be established in your awareness. You are not responsible for returning because someone else is destabilized. You are not obligated to remain the ground for a structure that stripped you of sovereignty. At this stage, detachment is no longer an action, it becomes a state. You are not trying not to react. You simply are no longer triggered. And when you are no longer standing as the foundation of their power, a very particular phase begins, one that looks uneventful from the outside, but inside the narcissist's psychological system, a silent fracture has formed. Not because you disappeared, not because you cut them off, not because you did anything dramatic, but because you are still there, and yet they can no longer control you. This is the moment when the narcissist begins to realize, not intellectually, but through a deeply instinctive sensation, that something has slipped beyond their reach. And that something is not you. It is their ability to access your inner world. At this stage, the narcissist usually does not panic immediately. On the contrary, their first response is often suspicion mixed with denial. They feel the change clearly. You still speak when necessary. You remain polite when required. You may even still be physically present, but the energy is different. You no longer fluctuate to their rhythm. You no longer shift your inner state because of a look, an ambiguous remark, or an extended silence. And because a narcissist lives by reading other people's reactions in order to orient themselves, this shift places them in a subtle state of disorientation. They cannot quite name it, but they sense that their familiar tools, silence, blame, seduction, nostalgia, victimhood, no longer produce the same effect. You do not react wrong, but you also do not react in the way they need. You do not fight, but you also do not participate. And it is precisely this state of not playing the role that begins to make them uneasy. From a Jungian perspective, the human ego requires reflection in order to sustain a sense of existence, and the persona requires a stable stage in order to keep performing the role it has chosen. A narcissist with a fragile inner structure is especially dependent on both. When you were still reacting, still triggered, still explaining or suffering, you inadvertently confirmed that the stage still existed, that their performance was still working. But when you detach, when your reactions no longer carry the urgency of survival, the narcissist begins to experience a kind of ego disorientation, an intensely uncomfortable disturbance in which they are no longer sure who they are in your eyes. And because they are used to defining themselves through the impact they have on others, losing that impact drops them into a deeply unpleasant emptiness, closer to bewilderment than to sadness. From here, a sequence of reaction scanning behaviors often begins to appear. The narcissist may suddenly send messages that seem harmless but are highly experimental, bring up old memories, mention moments that once made you soften, or place you in ambiguous situations to see whether you still waver. If that fails, they may switch to abrupt silence, disappear without explanation, hoping to reactivate the familiar anxiety in you. In other cases, they may present themselves as fragile, remorseful, or even awakened, not because they have truly changed, but because these are roles that once helped them reclaim emotional regulation over you in the past. What matters is this: none of these behaviors are about connection. They are about restoring control. The narcissist is not asking, "Do I still matter to you?" The hidden question underneath is, "Can I still control your state?" This is where the difference between true detachment and merely keeping distance becomes sharply visible. If you are only keeping distance behaviorally, but inwardly, you are still waiting, still wondering, still hoping they will finally realize something, the narcissist will sense it and continue testing until they find a foothold again. But if you have detached at a deeper level, meaning you no longer attach your self-worth to their reactions, those behaviors begin to lose their effect in a very noticeable way. You can read a message without your heart racing. You can witness their silence without automatically filling in meanings. You can hear an apology without being pulled into an urgent need to decide. And it is precisely this unforced calm that drives the narcissist into a quiet panic, because they no longer know how to switch you on. The paradox is that the narcissist rarely recognizes that this is the moment their power is dying. Instead, they usually interpret it in ego-protective ways. They may tell themselves, "You are cold, you have changed, you are selfish, or you have been influenced by someone else." These interpretations allow them to avoid the central truth: you are no longer within their gravitational field. And because the narcissist cannot self-regulate internally, losing someone who used to perform that function forces them to face the states they have always avoided: emptiness, shame, meaninglessness, and especially the feeling of no longer being certain of their own existence. This is why, after your detachment, you may notice them becoming more erratic, more restless, or more extreme, not because they love you more, but because their psychological system is starved of its fuel. The crucial point that must be put back in its proper place is this: the moment a narcissist realizes they can no longer control you is not the moment they lose you. It is the moment they lose the ability to use you as an extension of their inner system. And this can happen without conflict, without declarations, without loud cutoffs. It happens in silence, in neutrality, in the state where you are no longer emotionally investing to keep that structure running. You do not defeat them. You do not prove anything. You simply stop occupying the position that allowed their power to exist. That is why, to a narcissist, your detachment is not an action they can negotiate with. It is a phenomenon they cannot control, cannot repair, and cannot reverse with familiar tactics. A narcissist does not attach to the real you the way a healthy person attaches. They attach to the function you unconsciously performed inside their inner life. That function can take many forms: the reasonable one, the one who endures, the one who holds the emotional rhythm, the one who explains their contradictions, the one who stays so everything does not collapse. While you think you are loving, trying, sacrificing for the relationship, at a deeper level you are keeping a dependent psychological structure running. The narcissist does not need you present as an independent individual. They need you present as an extension of the emotional regulation system they do not possess. And because this role operates quietly, without promises, without agreements, you rarely realize you have been pulled into it until you are exhausted. You are not loved for being you. You are kept because you make them feel stable, centered, valuable, positioned. When you detach, what dies first is not the relationship, but that role. And it is the disappearance of that role that is the true shock to the narcissist. They do not panic because they lost you as a person. They panic because they lost the function that helped them avoid themselves. This is why so many post-detachment reactions sound contradictory and irrational. One moment they accuse you of being cold, the next they claim you have changed. One moment they play the victim, the next they appear to move on quickly. These reactions are not truly about you. They are attempts to drag you back into the old function, because if the function is restored, their power is restored with it. In Jungian terms, when participation mystique is broken, when two psyches are no longer fused through projection and unconscious function, the narcissist is forced to face an emptiness they have never learned to endure. And because they lack a strong enough inner structure to stand in that emptiness, they will try anything to recreate the lost role, whether through nostalgia, guilt, or vague promises. What matters is that you see this clearly. If you return, not because you desire mutual connection, but because you miss feeling important, because you believe you were the only one who understood them, then you are not returning for love, you are returning for a role. At the deepest level, detachment is the moment you stop defining yourself through whether you are needed by someone else. And when that happens, the narcissist does not only lose you, they lose the foundation that allowed them to exist inside their own illusion of power. This is why your quiet withdrawal is more frightening than any rejection. It gives them no room to bargain, no object to manipulate, no role to keep performing. You do not fight them. You simply no longer stand inside the story they need you to continue telling. And precisely because you have left the old role, because you are no longer the ground their power stands on, the most subtle and most dangerous trap begins to appear. And that trap does not come from the narcissist. It comes from inside you. This is the point where many empaths return, not because they do not understand what happened, not because they are blindly in love, but because they cannot tolerate the new state that detachment brings. After a long time living in emotional tension, in repeated cycles of hope and disappointment, closeness and distance, your nervous system has grown accustomed to intensity. You have become used to always having something to react to fix, to analyze, to endure. When you detach, all of those stimuli vanish abruptly, and what remains is not immediate peace, but a state that is difficult to name: neutrality. Not acute pain, but not excitement either, not panic, but not the old feeling of being alive. And it is this neutrality that makes many empaths turn back, because they mistake it for emptiness, for loss, even for the sense that I have lost a part of myself. The trap is here. You believe you return because you still love, still care, still feel guilt. But at a deeper level, you return because you are not used to living without reacting. A nervous system conditioned by a highly activating relationship does not recognize neutrality as safety. It only knows that no intensity means something is wrong. And so you begin to question, to replay emotionally charged moments, to doubt your decision, to wonder if you were too cold, too harsh, too quick. If the narcissist appears at that exact moment, even with a vague message, a casual check-in, or even a suggestive silence, they can accidentally reactivate that familiar sensation. Not the feeling of being loved, but the feeling of being triggered. And your nervous system, confusing activation with connection, interprets it as proof that I still feel something, that this relationship still means something. This is why many empaths go back, not because they are weak, but because they have not yet rebuilt the inner structure required to tolerate a new way of living, a life without drama, without role, without the mission to rescue. What must be said plainly is this: real detachment does not bring an immediate sense of liberation or moral superiority. It brings an uncomfortable silence, because in that silence you are no longer defined by how important you are to someone else, how well you endure, how much you sacrifice. You begin to face a bare question. If I am no longer the one who holds things up, the one who understands, the one who keeps the rhythm, then where does my value live? And if you have not yet answered that question for yourself, it is easy to return to the old place simply to escape the discomfort of having no answer. The narcissist does not need to persuade you. Their presence alone can pull you back into the familiar state where you have a role, a function, a feeling of being needed. But the price is that you hand back the power you just withdrew, and the loop begins again, usually more refined and more psychologically expensive. The most dangerous trap after detachment, then, is not missing them, not being soft-hearted, but failing to distinguish peace from emptiness. Real peace does not deliver instant pleasure. It delivers the absence of stimulation. And for a nervous system used to chronic tension, that absence can be misread as loss. But if you stay with this state long enough, if you resist filling it with a new relationship, an old conversation, or an unfinished explanation, you will begin to realize something critical. Your emotional capacity is still intact. It is simply no longer being yanked by strings. You can still feel sadness, but sadness no longer drags you away. You can still remember, but memory no longer governs your decisions. You can still feel deeply, but you are no longer consumed. This is the sign that your nervous system is learning a new language, the language of self-regulation. And this process always comes with discomfort before it comes with freedom. Many empaths give up right here because they believe detachment must make them feel better, when in reality it first makes them feel less manipulated, and those two are not the same in the beginning. If one thing must be etched into this part, it is this: if you return only to feel that you still exist, you are not seeking love. You are seeking a familiar activation system. And if you cross this trap, if you can tolerate neutrality long enough to rebuild your own inner foundation, then from this point on, the story will no longer revolve around the narcissist. It will begin to revolve around you, not as the one who endures or the one who was chosen, but as a human being learning how to exist without needing anyone else to regulate emotions for them. And only when you pass that trap, when you stop returning just to escape the discomfort of neutrality, does a deeper pivot finally occur. A pivot in which the story no longer revolves around the narcissist, whether they appear or disappear. At this stage, what changes is not your behavior, but the inner ground you are standing on. Before, No matter how strong you seemed, there was still a deep part of you waiting for their reaction in order to define yourself. A look to confirm your value, a word to confirm you were chosen, a signal to tell you whether you were right or wrong. When detachment ripens, that waiting disappears. Not because you become cold, but because you stop questioning yourself inside their frame of reference. In Jungian terms, this is the moment libido truly withdraws back to the self, no longer projected onto an external object in order to maintain a sense of existence. You no longer need someone to activate your emotions to feel alive. You begin to feel life from the inside, slower, quieter, but far more stable. And this is what ends the narcissist's power completely. Because that power was never located in their words or actions, but in whether you still use them as the reference point for your inner life. At this stage, you may notice something strange. Even if they try to come back, try to draw attention, try to rebuild the old story through memories, guilt, or vague promises. It all sounds like an echo from a world you have already left. Not because you won, but because you are no longer operating on the same level. What once shook you now registers as information, no longer as survival. You can see their pain without feeling responsible to rescue them. You can see their regret without believing you must return to complete the story. You can watch them repeat old patterns without needing to prove you were right. This is the point where many people mistakenly believe they have become numb. The truth is the opposite. You have become discerning. You still feel, but you no longer dissolve into other people's emotions. You still have compassion, but that compassion no longer costs you your inner sovereignty. The core of this stage is that you have rebuilt the way you measure your own worth. Before, your worth was tied to how important you were in someone's life, how much you could keep from collapsing, how much you could sacrifice. When the pivot is complete, your worth begins to be measured by entirely different things. How honest you are with yourself, your ability to tolerate discomfort without betraying yourself, and your capacity to stay with truth even when truth does not feel pleasant. This is why many empaths, after true detachment, are no longer attracted to dramatic relationships, not because they fear love, but because their nervous system no longer interprets chaos as connection. They begin to understand that stability is not emptiness. It is the ground on which life can grow without constant defense. And when you can stand firmly in this place, the story of the narcissist closes naturally without needing a clear ending. You do not need closure from them, because closure already happened inside you the moment you stopped needing their reaction to know who you are. You do not need them to understand or change, because the only change that ever mattered has already taken place elsewhere. The narcissist's power does not die because they are punished. It dies because you no longer stand in the system that allows that power to exist. And this is the true end point of detachment. Not the disappearance of the other person, but the full emergence of you within your own inner life. From this moment on, whether you enter a relationship, love someone, or choose to be alone, you are no longer searching for another person to complete you. You are only looking for compatibility between two individuals who can already stand on their own. And that is where real power begins, not loud, not performative, but no longer something that can be taken away.